Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Pretreatment 101 webcast, POTW Pretreatment Considerations and Permitting Programs for Hauled Waste. This webcast is sponsored by EPA's Office of Water. I am Ann Zimmerman with Tetra Tech, and I will be leading today's webcast. Thank you for joining us. The National Pretreatment Program regulations specifically prohibit any trucked or hauled pollutants except at discharge points designated by the POTW. This webcast will focus on POTW considerations prior to accepting hauled waste and how a POTW can develop a permitting program to regulate this type of waste. Before our presentations, we will start by going over a few housekeeping items. Please note that the materials in this webcast have been reviewed by EPA staff for technical accuracy. The mention of any commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean that EPA endorses them. First, I would like to briefly summarize some of the features of today's webcast. If you have any technical difficulties, you can request assistance by entering your technical issue into the box at the bottom of your screen and clicking the Ask button to receive technical support. Responses to technical questions will appear at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to submit questions to our speakers during this webcast. A question and answer session will follow each of the presentations. To ask a question, simply type it in the box located at the bottom of your screen. Then click on the Ask button. Given the large number of participants today, I encourage you to submit your questions early. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. We will be reviewing all of the questions that you submit to us and will try to queue up as many questions to our speakers as possible. However, due to the number of participants, not all questions will be answered. We have posted the speaker's contact information in case you would like to contact them after this webcast. We will also be asking you some poll and quiz questions throughout the webcast. These questions will be posted in the slide window. Additionally, at the end of the webcast, you will be asked to complete an evaluation survey. Please submit your answers in that same slide window by clicking on one of the radio buttons. If you would like to see closed captioning, please make sure that you have turned off your pop-up blocker and click on the closed captioning button on the top of your screen. Please click on the Details and Downloads button to access our speaker's contact information and to download a copy of the slides. There's also a PDF document of additional resources. The document contains a list of commonly used pretreatment acronyms, guidance manuals, and documents, as well as speaker information. We recommend that you download this document. It can be found by clicking on the Downloads button. A certificate of participation will be available for audience members. The certificate button located on top of your screen will be activated after you have watched 90 minutes of this webcast. Furthermore, this webcast will be archived indefinitely, so you can access it a few weeks after today's live presentation. The archived webcast will be posted on EPA's website. To get us started, Ms. Jen Pickrell will review some topics to be covered during the webcast and provide some preliminary background information. Ms. Pickrell is EPA's National Pretreatment Program Coordinator in the Water Permits Division of the Office of Wastewater Management, otherwise known as OWM. She has been with OWM since 1997. Jan?
Thanks, Ann. Welcome, everyone. The focus of today's webcast is things that a POTW or publicly owned treatment works should consider when thinking about accepting waste that arrives to a POTW for treatment via truck or rail. And once a decision has been made to accept such hauled waste, things to consider when establishing a permitting program to management. Although today's webcast is advertised as part of the Pretreatment Program series, this topic is indeed pertinent for all publicly owned treatment works, regardless of whether the POTW is required to have a pretreatment program. I'll discuss that in more detail in the next couple of slides. But meanwhile, this slide shows a list of the currently available webinar topics that are all ready for viewing right now. Even if a POTW does not have a pretreatment program, I particularly recommend that all POTWs familiarize themselves with the pretreatment program basics the webinar, Introduction to the National Pretreatment Program. In addition, today's topic also works hand in hand with the second webinar on this list, Industrial User Waste Survey Procedures, and the one at the bottom, Industrial Users or IU Permitting. Each of these webinars may be accessed at the website identified at the bottom of the slide. Here is a list of the common acronyms used throughout the Pretreatment 101 Introductory Series. As speakers, we will try to minimize our use of acronyms, but I also advise you to go to the Resources document link at the bottom right corner of your screen to obtain more information on acronyms and to download additional resources that may be helpful to you on this topic. By the end of today's webcast, we will have covered all of these topics, so you see that we have a lot of ground to cover. First, I'll discuss the federal requirements, then I'll let our guest speakers discuss the rest of the topics. Why are we including the topic of hauled waste in our introductory pretreatment webinar series? The phrase hauled waste merely refers to a transportation method that gets a waste to the publicly owned treatment works or POTW. By the phrase hauled waste, we mean something that arrives at the POTW by truck or rail car. Essentially, it did not reach the POTW by way of a pipe between the generating facility and the POTW. The pretreatment regulations contain specific prohibitions, regardless of delivery method, concerning the introduction of pollutants. 7 of the specific prohibitions concern the wastewater quality or content characteristics. These include that the wastewater, introduced for treatment, cannot be corrosive, flammable, obstructive, and cannot cause the pass-through of pollutants through the POTW, nor the interference of the POTW's operation. For more detail, I refer you to the regulation at 40 CFR 403.5b. The 8th provision specifically speaks to industrial wastewater that arrives by truck or rail car. This provision prohibits any trucked or hauled pollutants from being introduced into a POTW except at discharge points designated by the POTW. In addition to these prohibitions, there are additional regulations that apply to certain types of wastewater. Those of you who listened to the Introduction to the National Pretreatment Program webinar should recall that a non-domestic source that introduces pollutants into a POTW, an industrial user, is subject to 3 types of pretreatment standards. The general and specific prohibitions of 40 CFR 403.5 was one of them. Do you remember the other 2 pretreatment standards? Yes. The second type is categorical pretreatment standards. Categorical pretreatment standards are standards or limitations that apply to wastewater from specific industrial sector processes. A wastewater that arrives at a POTW for treatment and disposal that is subject to categorical pretreatment standards, regardless of whether it arrived at the POTW via pipe or via truck or rail car, is still subject to those categorical pretreatment standards. And the third type of pretreatment standards? Local limits. Our guest speakers will elaborate more on how the source and characteristics of the wastewater affects the POTW. Now, shifting the focus away from the industrial user and the generator of the wastewater, the POTW also has reporting requirements that it must fulfill if it chooses to accept trucked-in wastewater. When the POTW fills out its NPDES permit application for renewal, a POTW must identify its industrial discharges. This requirement applies to industrial discharges that reach the POTW via pipe, the more traditional pretreatment means of conveyance, as well as industrial discharges that reach the POTW via truck. In addition, another POTW NPDES application requirement is for the POTW to identify any hazardous waste or Superfund type of site remediation or cleanup wastewater that it is accepting, again, regardless of how it reaches the POTW. 40 CFR 122.21 is a section of the federal regulations that outline application requirements for the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits. Now, let's shift to the time period after the NPDES permit has already been issued to the POTW and the POTW is following the requirements of its permit. The NPDES permit regulation also says that all POTW NPDES permits should contain a standard requirement that if the POTW decides to start accepting any new pollutants that it was not previously receiving or reported that it intended to receive when it filed for its discharge permit or its renewal permit, that this information must be reported to the NPDES Permitting Authority and Pretreatment Authority. This condition in the NPDES permit requires the POTW to identify the new pollutants that it is intending to accept, identify any substantial change that that new pollutant or pollutants might have on the overall volume or character of the pollutants being received at the POTW, and report on how the quality and quantity of this new effluent being received at the POTW will impact the POTW's effluent volume and quality. This information is required to be reported with adequate notice that this NPDES permitting authority has enough time to determine if the POTW's permit needs to be modified to contain new permit limits or even a pretreatment program due to the effect of these new pollutants. So, before we start discussing more detailed about hauled waste programs, Anne, would you like to say anything more to our listening audience?
Thanks, Jan. Before we begin with our presentations, we have a couple of quick poll questions for our audience participants. Question 1. Have you participated in any of the previous Pretreatment 101 webcasts? If you could indicate yes or no on your screen. To choose your answer, please click on the appropriate radio button in the window. While everyone is answering the question, I would like to remind everyone that all of the presentations today can be downloaded during the webcast. These presentations are helpful resources for future reference. I would also like to remind everyone that a certificate of participation will be available to you once you have listened to at least 90 minutes of this webcast. Thanks for answering the first poll question. Here is another quick poll question before we have the first speaker get started with their presentation. This question is for those of you that have participated in a previous Pretreatment 101 webcast. How did you access or participate in the previous webcast? A. Participated during the live webcast event. B. Listened to the archived webcast. Or C. Both. Some were live webcast events and others were archived events. Before we begin our presentations, please remember that you can submit your questions at any time during this webcast. To ask a question, simply type it in the box located at the bottom of your screen, then click on the Ask button. Great. Thanks for answering those quick poll questions. Our first speaker today is Ms. Lynn Kurth. Lynn is an environmental scientist for Tetra Tech with more than 23 years of experience managing water resource planning and environmental and civil engineering projects for EPA and state and local environmental management offices. Lynn will overview the hauled waste requirements under the pretreatment program, accepting hauled waste at POTWs, and controls to implement and manage hauled waste. Lynn?
Thanks, Annie. As Jan mentioned, this is what we will address today. Definition of hauled waste and requirements under the National Pretreatment Program, types of hauled waste, consideration prior to accepting hauled waste, controls POTWs can use to manage hauled waste, including how to develop a permitting program, and issues specific to common waste types. What is hauled waste in the pretreatment program? Hauled waste is defined as any waste delivered to a POTW by a truck or rail car. It is untreated wastewater that is pumped into a treatment plant. Most commonly, hauled waste is delivered to POTWs by trucks, which are allowed to discharge their waste load to the POTW at a designated area. Hauled waste can also be delivered by rail. As Jan said, the requirements under the federal pretreatment regulations that address hauled waste are found in 40 CFR 403.5B8. They say that the discharge of trucked or hauled pollutants is prohibited except at points designated by the POTW. Most of what we will discuss today are recommendations for addressing hauled waste. All POTWs that accept hauled waste are encouraged to consider these recommendations, since they are intended to protect the treatment plant and POTW workers. More details on what we discussed today are in EPA's 1999 Guidance Manual for the Control of Waste Hauled to Publicly Owned Treatment Works. Today we will refer to it as the Hauled Waste Guidance Manual. It can be found at the website shown on the slide. This manual is going to be updated in 2013. Hauled waste may include domestic waste and non-domestic waste. Domestic waste, or septage, is usually generated from residential properties not connected to the wastewater collection system. Non-household or non-domestic hauled waste usually comes from commercial and industrial properties. This waste is typically much more concentrated than regular sewer wastewater. These wastes include grease traps, portable chemical toilets, landfill leachate, groundwater remediation, non-hazardous commercial or industrial waste, and hazardous industrial waste. Some industrial waste may be generated by processes that are subject to categorical standards under the pretreatment program. Categorical pretreatment standards are published by EPA for different categories of industrial users and are listed in 40 CFR Parts 405 through 471. We will discuss each of these waste types in more detail during the second half of this presentation. Before accepting hauled waste, the POTW needs to consider the potential impacts to the plant, determine what the plant capabilities are for accepting hauled waste, and characterize the waste to understand what it consists of. We will discuss each of these considerations in detail in the following slides. Because pollutants are usually more concentrated in hauled waste than in typical domestic wastewater, and because hauled waste may not be equalized when discharged, it may cause adverse impacts to treatment plants. Adverse impacts may include pass-through, interference, sludge contamination, plant overloads, bioaccumulation of toxics, and hazards to POTW personnel. Hauled waste discharges can cause pass-through at the plant. Pass-through occurs when a discharge from a POTW causes a violation of any requirement of the NPDES permit. Hauled waste can be more concentrated and can cause slug loadings to POTWs, which may cause pass-through and violate the POTW's NPDES permit and impact the receiving water. Pass-through of metals and organics to the receiving stream can cause toxicity and failure of the POTW to pass the whole effluent toxicity test. Hauled waste discharges can cause interference issues. Interference means inhibition or disruption of the POTW's treatment processes or operations, or its sludge processes, sludge use, or disposal. Interference can inhibit treatment and adversely impact the biological and mechanical treatment units. The toxic effects of metals and toxic organics contained in non-domestic waste can interfere with secondary wastewater treatment processes and cause the POTW to violate its NPDES permit. Hauled waste discharges can cause sludge inhibition and contamination by overloading the plant with organic and inorganic toxics. Toxic metal compounds in hauled waste can be particularly harmful to the plant, especially chromium, which can destroy bacteria used in the sludge digesters or inhibit their reproduction. This disrupts the sludge treatment process and produces sludge that cannot be disposed of or reused without additional treatment. Activated sludge treatment plants are especially sensitive to large variances in influent concentrations and toxic loads. Another adverse impact of hauled waste can be a slug discharge overload. If hauled waste is released at a rate that does not allow it to mix within the treatment plant, this could cause a slug discharge that could cause an organic or toxic overload at the treatment plant. Hauled waste may cause other nuisances, such as objectionable odors, pump or line clogging, foaming at the aeration tank, or additional cleaning and maintenance requirements. Hauled waste could also contain bioaccumulative and persistent substances that are not easily treated at all POTWs. Bioaccumulation means accumulation of a substance such as a toxic chemical in tissues of a living organism. Mercury and PCBs are examples of toxics that are highly bioaccumulative. POTWs must pay attention to the effects hauled waste may have on whole effluent toxicity, which is the aggregate toxic effect to aquatic organisms from all pollutants contained in a facility's effluent. These toxic pollutants can cause a violation of water quality standard in the receiving stream, even in small amounts, and they could accumulate in downstream sediments, flora, and fauna that may require future remediation. Exposure to toxic or hazardous substances in hauled waste can pose dangers to the safety and health of POTW employees. Toxics can volatilize into the atmosphere and workers can breathe it, or certain mixtures of substances can become explosive. Fires, explosions, and poisoning can be the lethal effects of certain hauled substances. Other health effects may include burns, nausea, headaches, and respiratory distress. It is important to know your treatment plant and know your service area. POTWs should conduct a survey to identify potential waste haulers in the area and to learn what types of waste they haul. The POTW should also determine what types of hauled waste can be accepted based on the plant capacity and treatment capabilities. We'll go into each of these next. As part of assessing POTW capabilities to accept hauled waste, it is helpful to identify all potential waste haulers operating in the area, including those in neighboring jurisdictions. POTW staff should consult these sources that might have information about waste hauler businesses. These sources include business license records, Chamber of Commerce rosters, local telephone directories, internet searches, city and state industrial directories, state and county health departments, and businesses identified as having grease traps and sand traps, and state lists of hazardous waste generators and treatment storage and disposal facilities. POTW should keep track of this information and update it periodically. This information can be shared with other POTWs in the area so that they will know about problem haulers that have been turned away before they show up somewhere else. While identifying the waste haulers in your service area, it is also important to understand the types of hauled waste that could be brought to your plant. POTW should determine how many of its users, whether domestic and non-domestic, do not have a sewer connection and therefore must haul their waste to the plant. If there are non-domestic users that must haul their waste, does the POTW know what is in that non-domestic waste? Does the POTW have a fog program that requires food service establishments to pump out their grease traps? If so, is that grease trap waste being hauled to the POTW? Know what's going on in your service area as far as what users are not hooked up to the sewer line and will be needing to have their wastewater hauled. There are several processes for understanding your plant's capabilities to treat hauled waste. These are technical feasibility analyses and local limits development. But first we'll mention that instead of conducting a careful study of the plant's capabilities to accept waste, sometimes POTW personnel adopt one of the following two approaches. Refusing the waste if it contains pollutants not on a predetermined list of acceptable pollutants at certain levels. If this approach is taken, the POTW should have some alternatives for where the hauler can go so that the waste is disposed of properly. Another approach is the accept and watch approach. This is when plants accept the waste and monitor it and record any observable impacts. If there are no adverse impacts, the POTW continues to accept the waste. If there are adverse impacts, the POTW rejects any further waste of that nature or determines what actions may reduce or eliminate the impacts. Please note that the accept and watch approach places the POTW in a vulnerable position if the waste causes interference or pass-through. One way to minimize the risk of accepting hauled waste is for the POTW to conduct a technical feasibility analysis. This analysis is similar to and uses information from the local limits development process. This analysis should determine whether the POTW has the hydraulic and organic capacity to handle the additional hauled waste. This process is also normally performed as part of local limits development. POTWs that have not developed local limits should contact their approval authority for assistance or consult the local limits guidance manual. The POTW should determine if the unit operations are suitable for treatment of the pollutants in the hauled waste. For example, at what loading of total suspended solids or biochemical oxygen demand or other pollutants does impairment of sludge settling or dewatering occur? The feasibility analysis should also determine if the POTW has the ability to control feed rates of hauled waste to the treatment plant. Systems acclimated to a specific type of waste can be shocked if waste with different characteristics is introduced suddenly as a slug load. Shocks can be prevented if the POTW has the ability to gradually mix this waste with its other incoming wastewater to minimize or eliminate the fluctuations caused by the waste. In conducting plant analyses, it is always preferred that each POTW use actual values, but if no actual values are available to determine plant inhibition thresholds, for example, the POTW can then use literature values, but should continue to monitor to determine if literature values are protective of the plant. Local limits development generally includes determining the amount of each pollutant that can be accepted at the headworks and the maximum allowable industrial loadings. This process is helpful in determining treatment capability to accept hauled waste. Local limits do not typically apply to hauled domestic waste. However, some POTWs do apply them, and that is at the POTW's discretion. Conducting a technical feasibility analysis and local limits development are the basis for determining what type of hauled waste can be accepted at the plant. Again, for more information on the development of local limits, please refer to the Local Limits Development Guidance. In order to decide whether a POTW should accept waste from a particular hauler and before a permit is issued, the POTW should characterize the waste to ensure that it won't disrupt operations at the plant. This analysis is important, and POTWs should not accept hauled waste from a hauler that has not been through the characterization and permitting process established by the POTW. A POTW should ask these questions. We will go through each of these. To characterize the waste, the POTW should follow the process in this flowchart. Determine the source of the waste. Where is it from? Is it domestic from a residential source or non-domestic from a commercial or industrial source? Is it considered hazardous under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act? If so, then the POTW should consult their local and state regulations regarding accepting hazardous waste and determine if their treatment plant can handle this type of waste. You should also ask, is the hauled waste subject to categorical standards? Does it meet them? If not, the POTW can either require pretreatment prior to accepting it or reject it. To further characterize non-domestic hauled waste, you should also ask, what pollutants are in the waste and at what levels? Does the POTW have local limits for all of the pollutants of concern in the hauled waste? If not, does the POTW need to develop additional local limits to control hauled waste? For domestic and non-domestic hauled waste, the POTW should also consider whether the waste could cause toxic effects, health and safety issues, corrosion, or cause slug loadings, interference, or pass-through. If yes to any of these questions, then pretreatment can be required prior to acceptance, or the waste load can be rejected. If the waste load contains domestic and non-domestic waste, then the non-domestic branch of this flow chart should be followed. After this analysis, the POTW should have a general idea about whether the hauled waste will be acceptable for discharge to the plant. More specific data can be collected during the permitting process, which will be discussed next under how POTWs can manage hauled waste.
Well, that was a brief overview of types of hauled waste, potential impacts, and the characterization of hauled waste. Before we continue on with the rest of Lynn's presentation, here is a quick quiz question for everyone in the audience. This is a multiple choice question. What are potential adverse impacts to the POTW from hauled waste? A, interference, B, pass-through, C, sludge contamination, or D, all of the above? To answer this question, please use the radio buttons to the left of your choice and click Submit. Do not type your answers in the Ask a Question box. While we give everyone a chance to answer, a reminder, if you have any questions for our speakers today, you can submit those questions at any time during this webcast. Please type in your questions in the Ask a Question box. We will try to answer as many of your questions as possible. It looks like everyone has a chance to answer. The correct answer is D, all of the above. As Lynn mentioned earlier, because pollutants are usually more concentrated in hauled waste than in typical domestic wastewater, and because hauled waste may not be equalized when discharged, adverse impacts may include pass-through, interference, sludge contamination, plant overloads, bioaccumulation of toxics, and hazards to POTW personnel. Now let's continue with the rest of Lynn's presentation. Lynn, back to you.
Thank you. All right, let's talk about managing hauled waste. These are several types of controls POTWs can use. In addition to the federal requirement that a POTW have a designated discharge point if it accepts hauled waste, it also must have the legal authority to implement its hauled waste program. State law determines what authorities a POTW may possess. So, the POTW must be aware of these laws when developing or seeking modifications to its local ordinance. The local ordinance must describe all of the controls in sufficient detail so that waste haulers and POTW personnel will understand the procedures, expectations, and liabilities associated with the hauled waste program. Additional methods for managing hauled waste is to have designated controlled disposal sites, applying numerical and narrative standards, and issuing waste hauler permits. Other methods for managing waste include implementing a monitoring program, having a waste tracking manifest system, having procedures for identification of illegal dischargers, implementing communication mechanisms, and systematically maintaining data and information. We will now go into more detail about each of these controls for managing hauled waste. The local ordinance should contain the following provisions. A provision that the POTW can require commercial, industrial, and residential waste haulers to obtain a permit. A prohibition on the discharge of hauled waste except at points designated by the POTW. A requirement that the hauled waste must meet all applicable pretreatment standards and requirements. The ordinance should also allow the POTW to permit and regulate the generators of hauled wastes. That the POTW may collect samples. That no load can be discharged without prior consent of the POTW. That the POTW may require the hauler to provide a waste analysis of any load prior to discharge. A requirement that waste haulers must use a manifest system, that the POTW can impose penalties for violating the ordinance or waste hauler permit. The current hauled waste guidance manual provides examples of waste hauler ordinance provisions. Another control POTWs can use to manage hauled waste is to have a controlled designated disposal site. This includes choosing an appropriate site, designing site access, and setting hours of operation. As stated earlier, Federal regulations require POTWs that accept hauled waste to designate a specific discharge point. Some POTWs specify discharge sites that are located at the treatment plant, while others allow hauled waste to be discharged at remote sites within the collection system, like at manholes or pump stations. Factors to consider when designating the location of a discharge site include sensitivity of the treatment plant to pollutant loadings directly to the headworks, vehicle access, wear on roads from heavy trucks, security and visibility, and availability of space for holding facilities. These factors and others are explained more fully in the current hauled waste guidance manual. POTWs typically have hauled waste discharged to the headworks, although depending on the plant, further upstream may be better so the waste has more time to mix and be diluted. Some plants have holding facilities to allow for mixing or for better control of flow and loadings to the headworks. If discharges are allowed at remote areas, these sites can be more difficult and possibly more costly to manage because of personnel and security needs. Hauled waste receiving stations typically include an unloading area, a receiving and storage tank, and transfer pumps. A water hose should be provided for cleanup of the unloading station as well as to wash off the truck. Access to the receiving station needs to be controlled to prevent illegal discharges and to have better control over the discharges. Manual locking gates can be installed at the site entrance. Many facilities are now equipped with an electronic card access system. Permitted haulers are given an electronic card which serves as a key to the facility and which may be also used for waste hauler tracking and billing. A potential drawback to this system is that cards may be lent to unpermitted haulers. If discharge areas are unmanned, security cameras should be used. When setting hours of operation for accepting hauled waste, POTW should consider the times when plant personnel are available, when peak and low flows occur within the collection system and treatment plant, and when haulers are likely to want access. 24-hour access may be appropriate for some facilities. It may increase the period of time between hauled waste discharges and increase flexibility for haulers. We've already talked about using limits and standards to assess whether a waste load will impact the plant. These limits are also controls that POTW can use to decide to refuse a waste hauler's request for a permit application and reject a particular waste load if applicable numerical limits are exceeded. A waste load can also be rejected based on whether the waste meets narrative prohibitions against discharges that cause toxic fumes and gases, explosive conditions, flammable conditions, corrosive conditions, other health and safety hazards to POTW employees. A visual observation should be made on all hauled waste loads to evaluate the viscosity, odor, and color, and any unusual characteristics can be noted and further tests conducted if necessary. A permit system is the most direct and efficient method of monitoring and regulating waste haulers. First, as mentioned earlier, you need to ensure that your sewer use ordinance provides the POTW with the legal authority to issue and enforce permits. Part of the permitting process should be to require each waste hauler requesting to discharge to complete a permit application. The permit application form should provide the POTW with all information necessary to identify, track, communicate with, and manage waste haulers. Based on information from the permit application, the POTW can decide whether or not to issue a permit. The permit application should require this information: name of business and owner, address and phone number, estimated number and volume of loads, number and capacity of vehicles, hours of operation, names of other POTWs where hauled waste is discharged, any analytical or physical data collected, list of customers, and a description of each customer's waste. Description of waste includes waste type, the process generating the waste, frequency and volume of hauled waste shipments, whether the waste is subject to federal categorical pretreatment standards, and whether the waste is hazardous as defined in 40 CFR Part 261. A sample waste hauler's permit application is in the current hauled waste guidance manual. Based on information from the permit application, the POTW will decide whether or not to issue a permit. Before we get into permit contents, I'd like to point out that if a waste hauler meets the definition of a significant industrial user and the POTW has an approved pretreatment program and adequate legal authority, the POTW should permit the waste hauler as a significant industrial user, and the permit must include all required conditions. Waste hauler permits should contain these components: right of refusal to accept waste. The POTW should maintain the right to refuse any hauled waste load. Description of type of load to be discharged. The waste hauler should be limited to discharging only the type of waste that has been approved. Prohibited discharges. Waste haulers must always be prohibited from discharging waste which would violate any prohibited discharge standards of the general pretreatment regulations or any local prohibited discharges. National categorical pretreatment standards. If a hauler discharges categorical processed wastewater, the permit must require compliance with applicable categorical standards. Applicable discharge limits. The permit should contain any local limits if established by the POTW or any other pollutant the POTW wants to control based on waste characteristics or plant capabilities. Permits should also contain a designated disposal site and state all facility rules for discharging, such as cleanup requirements, numbers of loads, and rate of discharge. If a POTW is susceptible to hydraulic or organic overloading, it may wish to consider placing a limit on the maximum number of loads that a waste hauler can discharge over a specified time period. The rate of discharge should also be designated. Time limitations. Specific days and hours that waste haulers are allowed to discharge should be stated in the permit conditions. Waste tracking manifest system. The permit should contain a condition that requires the waste hauler to provide documentation on the nature, origin, and volume of the wastes being discharged. Notification of change of waste type. The POTW may want to require that any new waste be approved prior to being hauled. Standard conditions. These include modification of conditions, non-transferability, revocation of permit, and penalties and fines. The POTW could also consider requiring waste haulers to post a performance bond. For more information on permitting procedures, refer to the Industrial User Permitting Guidance Manual. Another control available to POTWs is to implement a monitoring program to conduct sampling of hauled wastes. We will go over each of these elements of a monitoring program. An important reason to monitor waste haulers is to determine whether the hauler is meeting the standards in its permit. POTW should have a monitoring program to gather information about the characteristics of hauled waste and to determine if a particular waste load should be rejected because of potential negative impacts to the facility. A monitoring program can provide information on which loads and what pollutants and concentrations caused problems in plant operations. A monitoring program also demonstrates to the waste haulers that the POTW is serious about enforcing its requirements. In addition to conducting sampling and analysis of loads from industrial sources, POTWs can review the material safety data sheets for specific chemicals and results of any toxicity characteristics leaching procedures studies. Sampling must be done properly to assist with the decision to accept a waste load or not. Under a pretreatment program, methods from 40 CFR Part 136 are required for sample collection, preservation, storage, and analysis to obtain reliable results. It is very important to use these approved methods so that consistent measurements are taken and so that they will be acceptable as evidence and enforcement proceedings are necessary. There is rapid toxicity testing equipment available to help determine if the POTW biological process will be impacted at particular concentrations or loading rates. At a minimum, a base sampling program for hauled waste should include visual observation and recording of any unusual odors, color, and viscosity. Analyzing for pH is perhaps the most effective way to discover incompatible loads and can be performed rapidly without great cost to the POTW or the waste hauler. A pH test should be conducted on all waste loads from non-domestic sources. An explosivity meter can also be used routinely on all non-domestic loads, but should always be used on loads suspected of containing chemicals that can create explosive gases. The monitoring program should include collection of a grab or composite sample of the hauled waste. Additional field monitoring and laboratory instruments available for sampling hauled waste are listed in the Hauled Waste Guidance Manual. There are two types of samples, grab samples and composite samples. A grab sample is a single, discrete sample collected over a short period of time without regard to the waste stream flow. Grab samples are useful in taking a snapshot of a discharge and can provide information on the extreme pollutant concentrations of a load, whereas composite sampling may mask the extreme pollutant levels. Grab samples may be used if both flow and pollutant concentrations or loadings are constant and should only be employed if the POTW operator has determined that the waste is homogeneous. Grab sampling is required for some parameters, namely pH, oil and grease, temperature, total phenol, cyanide, sulfides, and volatile organics. Composite samples measure the average amount of pollutants discharged by a waste hauler during the entire discharge period. Composite samples for waste haulers are most appropriate when the discharge is non-homogeneous or is stratified in the hauler's tanks. A composite sample is a mixed sample that is formed by combining a series of individual and discrete grab samples. Grab samples for compositing should be taken at least 3 times during the discharge, once at the onset of the discharge, where a higher concentration of solids are likely to occur, once in the middle of the discharge, and once at the end of the discharge where light oils are most likely to appear. The frequency of sampling hauled waste loads is decided by the POTW. It can sample every waste load, a certain percentage of waste loads, or totally randomly. The POTW can also decide if it wants to analyze every sample or collect samples and store them for possible analysis. POTWs establish sampling frequencies based on many things, including impacts on the treatment plant, staffing and resources, and the compliance history of individual haulers. There are several methods used by POTWs to track hauled waste discharges to their systems. Some have automated systems, and the haulers swipe an electronic card with a magnetic strip, and information is entered into the POTW's database. Many POTWs still use a paper manifest system to record information on hauled waste. Waste haulers enter information on the waste manifest form for each load received. The manifest form and the electronic system should include information such as name, address, and phone number, types of waste collected, approximate volumes received by the hauler, known or suspected pollutants, certification that the waste is not hazardous or subject to categorical standards, and results of any testing performed on the wastewater. This tracking system control can be employed independently of a permit system. Examples of waste hauler manifests are provided in the current Hauled Waste Guidance Manual. Here's a picture of an automated hauled waste tracking system kiosk that the waste haulers use at POTWs. Identification of a waste hauler as the source of pass-through or interference can be difficult. Hauled waste can be discharged to a manhole and the hauler long gone before the waste reaches the treatment plant. EPA has also seen several examples where hazardous waste haulers have paid industries for the seclusion their facility provides during such illegal discharge events. Approaches to help alleviate the problem include periodic sampling of suspected sewer lines, surveillance of waste haulers and suspected discharge points, education of industries concerning the seriousness of these violations, increased public awareness of illegal dumping, and increased enforcement. Many states have enforcement programs to assist POTWs in detecting illegal dischargers. EPA's Criminal Investigation Division or the FBI or local law enforcement officials can also be asked to assist in surveillance activities and enforcement. Video surveillance of suspected manholes or storm drains is also a possible option. Some POTWs lock manholes to discourage illegal dumping at suspected sites. Good communication with other POTWs and waste haulers is another control. To effectively manage hauled waste, all POTWs within a geographic region should readily share the information they have on waste haulers. When a POTW rejects a load, the operator should contact nearby facilities where the waste may be delivered and inform them about why the load was rejected. If a waste load is rejected, the POTW could also request the hauler to provide information on when and where the rejected load was eventually discharged. POTWs should also communicate with each other to identify frequent violators. A list of haulers with frequent violations, including type of violation, can be distributed among regional POTWs. POTWs should also have a mechanism to communicate with waste haulers. POTW operators can establish a mailing list of all local waste haulers and provide them with periodic information on changes in plant policy, reminders of existing plant policies that are frequently abused, and changes in operating times and fees. POTWs are sometimes the only source of regulatory information for waste haulers. POTWs should periodically review and update their hauled waste control methods. Additionally, if the type or amount of hauled waste received changes, the controls should be reviewed to determine if additional controls are needed. For example, if a POTW has been receiving only domestic hauled waste and has implemented procedures to control the discharge of that waste, the introduction of hauled non-domestic waste may require the implementation of additional controls, such as increased monitoring. POTWs should establish a system for maintaining waste hauler information, including haulers and the types of waste approved for discharge, receipts of hauled waste loads, sampling results, and other relevant information. Maintaining this information will allow the POTW to track the types and amounts of hauled waste received and may assist in identifying the source of a waste load that caused problems. Data and information can be maintained in hard copy form, electronically, or both. This data can be shared with other POTWs in the area to prevent problem haulers from impacting other plants.
Thank you, Lynn, for discussing the different types of hauled waste, potential impacts to the POTW, controlling hauled waste, as well as characterization and monitoring hauled waste. While we sort out all of your questions, let's take a moment to ask the audience another quiz question. This is a true or false type question. This question deals with the monitoring hauled waste at the POTW. True or false, the sample type should be a grab sample when the hauled waste is not well mixed or is stratified in the hauler's tank. Remember, when answering any of these questions, please use the radio buttons to the left of your choice and click Submit. Do not type your answers in the Ask a Question box. Thanks for answering that quick quiz question. The correct answer is false. Composite samples for waste haulers are most appropriate when the discharge is not well mixed or is stratified in the hauler's tanks. Composite samples measure the average amount of pollutants discharged by a waste hauler during the entire discharge period. Before we get to the first Q&A session for Lynn, I believe we have another poll question on the number of participants at your viewing location. How many people are participating at your location today? A, just 1, B, 2 to 5, C, 6 to 10, D, 11 to 20, or E, more than 20. While we are waiting for everyone to answer, I would like to remind the audience that there is a resources document available for downloading. This document contains a variety of useful resources. I would also like to remind everyone that there are several archived Pretreatment 101 webcasts that can be found on the EPA NPDES website. Please visit that site for more information. While everyone is answering the poll question, let's take a couple of the audience members' questions that came in for Lynn. Lynn, this first question here is a good one. How do you determine what to charge for hauled waste? And do you have any idea of the ranges that POTWs charge?
Thanks, Annie. Well, each POTW needs to consider the treatment cost for each type of hauled waste. A POTW should consider the costs associated with treating the biological oxygen demand, total suspended solids, oil and grease, and other pollutants of concern that will impact the POTW's treatment ability and capacity. We've seen values in the field ranging from $20 to $100 per 1,000 gallons of liquid waste. POTWs also charge other fees, such as permit fees, vehicle inspection fees, and trip ticket book fees. Fog waste charges are normally higher, with costs ranging from $50 to $200 per 1,000 gallons. Again, to determine what to charge, each POTW should assess the total treatment costs, including sludge disposal, for each hauled waste type.
Great. Thanks for answering. I think we have time for one more. What should we do if we don't have an official program yet, but a hauler shows up with a waste load and money to pay?
Well, it's up to the POTW to decide whether to accept the hauled waste, but as we've recommended, having a program and being proactive is the most protective of your plant. As we said, some POTWs do the accept and watch approach, which can cause problems. If you are sure it's purely septage waste, there may be less of a risk, but as EPA recommends, it is always more protective of your plant to have a hauled waste program that is proactive in regulating waste haulers. You can refer to the flow diagram in my presentation for additional information. Regardless, the POTW should be aware of any additional state requirements for accepting hauled waste.
Great, thanks. Before we introduce our next speaker, here's another poll question for the audience. What kind of entity are you? A, POTW and/or local government, B, EPA or state personnel, C, industry or an industrial facility, D, an academic institution, E, a consultant or contractor, and F, other. Thank you to the audience members for answering our questions. Let's continue with our presentations. For our second speaker today, we have Mr. Byron Ross, who will discuss issues specific to each hauled waste type. Byron has over 22 years of experience in industrial pretreatment, wastewater treatment, receiving stream assessment, and environmental sampling and monitoring. In 2003, Byron started Monitoring and Management Services, LLC, a small business that provides technical assistance to federal, state, and local government agencies in the areas of industrial pretreatment and capacity management, operations, and maintenance. Byron?
Thanks, Ann. Hello, everyone. Lynn covered an overview of hauled waste types, potential impacts, and control mechanisms. Now I want to try to provide some more detailed information on each of the hauled waste types. We will cover the definition and sources for each hauled waste type, identify some of the pollutants of concern, as well as the pollutant concentrations that could be expected from each hauled waste type. And we will cover some POTW impacts and some control options to prevent problems at the POTW. please keep in mind we will present pollutant concentrations for various types of hauled waste. These pollutant concentrations are provided to give you an idea of the concentration ranges that you may find in each hauled waste type. The range of hauled waste pollutant concentrations can vary significantly. Each POTW should conduct analysis of each type of hauled waste that the wastewater treatment plant receives. There can be some unusual local conditions that may cause particular pollutant concentrations for specific types of hauled waste to have very different results. Here's a list of the various types of hauled waste we will cover. Lynn has gone over these, but want to point out the three most common types of hauled waste that many wastewater treatment plants receive are domestic septage, portable toilet or chemical toilet waste, and fats, oils, and grease or fog waste. So we're going to start with these three. I wanted to include a little hauled waste humor as we start out here. If you can't quite see what it says on the back of the truck, the words are "a flush beats a full house." So anyway, so much for our humor. Domestic septage waste is defined as the liquid or solid material removed from a septic tank, cesspool, holding tank, or a similar system that receives only domestic waste, including household waste, non-commercial, and non-industrial sewage. Compared to sewage entering a POTW through the sewer collection system, domestic septage is often partially digested and has higher concentration of solids and heavy metals. And depending on the particular pollutant, septage waste can be anywhere from 2 to 100 times more concentrated than regular or domestic sewer wastewater. Again, the wide pollutant concentration range makes it a necessity to do site-specific analysis. These are typical concentrations of biochemical oxygen demand, or BOD, total solids, total suspended solids found in septic tank or septage waste. Pollutant concentration data presented is from the U.S. EPA Hauled Waste Guidance document, and also I appreciate Metro Water Services in Nashville, Tennessee, providing data that we will present today. We are currently collecting more hauled waste pollutant concentration range data and plan on that data being available for the update of the Hauled Waste Guidance document. Note that the average BOD concentration can be 20 times greater than domestic sewage coming from the wastewater collection system, and average total suspended solids can be 50 times greater than the domestic sewage in the collection system. Most pH ranges from septic tanks will be in the neutral range. If you conduct a pH analysis of hauled waste that has been identified as septage or septic tank waste, and the pH result is low, meaning less than 5 standard units, or high, say greater than 10 standard units, then this should send up a red flag warning you that the waste is probably not septage. The oil and grease results from the domestic septage regulatory guidance documents here in the slide appear high with a 6 to 12% range. But the main thing here is just keep in mind that there can be high concentrations of oil and grease in septage, especially if the septic tank that was pumped hasn't been pumped in a while and the resident has cooked a lot of fried food or greasy food. I wanted to showcase a couple of septage metals pollutant concentrations to make you aware of the potential impacts on the POTW. Here you can see that zinc concentrations in septage can be very high compared to domestic wastewater coming from the sewer collection system. Also note that the literature values for zinc inhibition for biological treatment systems start near 0.5 milligrams per liter. Of course, each POTW is unique, and zinc loading from septage hauled waste needs to be considered to protect the POTW from inhibition and interference. The domestic sources of zinc in septage include personal hygiene products, plumbing pipes, and some cities may add zinc polyphosphate to their drinking water as a corrosion inhibitor. Also, zinc is a carrier for many prescription medications. One POTW said that they had an incident where the septic tank waste from an elderly couple's house had extremely high zinc concentrations, even greater than 1,000 milligrams per liter. The source was thought to be medications that the couple was taking. Another metal that can have high concentrations in septic waste is copper. One of the main sources is water pipe corrosion. Due to the cost of copper, many new houses do not have copper pipes installed. But it should be noted that copper can leach from the copper pipes over a long period of time. New copper pipes may have copper concentrations of 2 to 6 milligrams per liter. As you can see from this list of septic metals, waste metals concentrations, there are several other metals that have much higher concentrations than domestic wastewater from the sewer collection system. Please be aware of the potential for metals concentrations in septic that could impact your plant. Some other pollutants of concern in septic include ammonia, sulfide, and some organic pollutants. A quick note regarding sampling for organic pollutants. When you're sampling, make sure that you are not near any odor masking agents in the wastewater treatment plants. For example, aerosol sprays that are odor masking agents that may contain pentachlorophenol or other organic chemicals. You don't want to get a false positive result from activity occurring in the wastewater treatment plant. Septic controls, Lynn mentioned several, but waste manifest should include the type of waste, location, facility ID, date and time of when the waste was pumped, hauler's company, and the driver's name. POTW personnel should document any unusual observations in odor, color, or other unusual characteristics of the waste. We mentioned about pH variation less than 5, greater than 10. It's a good indicator it's not septic tank waste if it's outside of that range. If the waste manifests, visual observations, and pH are questionable, it is strongly recommended to collect a sample. Some wastewater treatment plants collect a random sample every 10 waste loads. In some cases, a grab sample is collected for metals, organics, and of course a grab sample is required for pH. Some POTWs make a composite sample of the daily septic waste to get an indication of the daily loading to the POTW. Retention or storage of the hauled waste is done at many POTWs and is strongly recommended. This allows the POTW to assess the potential for inhibition or upset of the plant and allows the POTW to discharge the hauled waste in a controlled manner to prevent a shock loading to the plant. Some POTWs have continuous pH monitoring of the hauled waste. An example here of a POTW in Fairfax County, Virginia, they've installed a fully automatic pH screening discharge facility. Waste are discharged to an underground temporary holding tank and automatically tested for pH. If the load is acceptable, waste haulers record the reading from a meter into a daily log. If the pH is too high or too low, the waste is held and POTW personnel are notified by an alarm. The waste is tested once again and if found to be incompatible, rejected and pumped back into the truck. Other monitoring considerations include not only protection of the POTW, but also the POTW workers' safety. Combustible gas meters and oxygen level meters would be necessary, especially if the hauled waste receiving station is in an enclosed building. Colorimetric tubes work when a measured volume of gas or air is drawn through the tube, which contains chemicals. The color of the tube will change in response to the presence of the specific target gas or range of gases that are present in the sample. A redox meter, or oxygen reduction, or ORP, or meter, is a meter that measures the capacity of a system capacity to oxidize. That means they lose electrons or reduce or gain electrons. Chemicals like chlorine, bromine, ozone, or oxidizers. Extreme negative or positive results can indicate potential problems. For example, excessive chlorine in wastewater will result in a large positive value, and the presence of hydrogen sulfide will result in a negative number. Flashpoint testers or closed cup test is a test that the liquid has a vapor pressure, which is a function of the liquid's temperature. As the temperature increases, the vapor pressure increases. The test measures the lowest temperature at which there will be enough flammable vapor to ignite in a closed cup situation when there is an ignition source. Receiving stations, Lynn touched on this. There are a variety of automated grinder and screening devices that wastewater treatment plants use as pretreatment to remove all kinds of material, including plastics, metal, paper, rocks, etc., from the waste prior to treatment in the POTW treatment units. Fats, oils, and grease, moving on to one of my personal favorite, hauled waste. There are two types of oil and grease waste: animal or plant or vegetable fats, oils, and grease, or petroleum-based oils and greases. We will concentrate on the animal or vegetable origin fog waste that are typically collected from grease interceptors and grease traps that collect the kitchen plumbing fixture wastewater at food service establishments. Here in the slide, we have a picture of a recently installed 2,000-gallon grease interceptor at a food service establishment. And to the right of the screen is a diagram of grease interceptor with a fog layer on the top and the food solids layer at the bottom of the tank. Grease interceptors, or in some cities they refer to these as outdoor grease traps, can have capacities that normally range from 500 gallons to 3,000 gallons. The other type of oil and grease waste is petroleum-based waste that are collected from commercial or industrial sources, such as from oil water separators at car washes, auto shops, or stormwater treatment tanks. Petroleum-based oils and grease from commercial and industrial oil water separators can have hazardous or prohibited chemicals that should not be discharged to the POTW. Disposal should be in an approved petroleum waste handling facility. You can see from this data that you can expect the fog-hauled waste to have higher concentrations of BOD, suspended solids, and oil and grease than with the septage. Thus, the POTW treatment requirements are greater, as well as the potential for organic overloading, upset, or interference to the POTW. Fog waste pH can be a problem. Fog is made up of long-chain triglycerides and glycerol, which means that there are 3 fatty acids included. These fatty acids are weak acids, but under the right circumstances can cause low pH problems. Anaerobic conditions in the interceptor or trap, soft drinks, cleaners, disinfectants, and sugars help to drive the pH down. Sugars can act as a catalyst for biological activity that drives the pH down. One food service establishment that made donuts had a deteriorated, leaking grease interceptor due to a pH problem. The pH was 1.7 standard units. This particular food service establishment started adding sodium hydroxide to keep the pH above 5 standard units. It is recommended to monitor the sewer collection system and wastewater treatment plant for pH problems or corrosion impacts, not only at the haul waste receiving station, but also below food service establishments. As I just mentioned on the previous slide, corrosion problems can be associated with fog waste and industrial user food or drink manufacturers. Please keep this in mind for your monitoring program. The metals concentrations for fog waste are not as high as septage waste, but still need to be accounted for in determining the loading to the POTW. Just to note that the upper picture has the manhole access for a grease interceptor, the 2 manholes there, which collects brown grease. That's from the indoor kitchen fixtures. And in the upper part of that photo is a grease recycling bin where yellow grease is used for beneficial reuse. This is the grease from the deep fryers or woks or what have you that is used for beneficial reuse. So the POTW should make sure that no food service establishment is pouring yellow grease down the sewer drain. Fog can be solid or viscous at ambient temperatures and can cause blockages in pipes, clogging of pumps, and coating and clogging of monitoring probes or float-triggered switches. Fog waste can cause a scum layer to form in the biological processes at the wastewater treatment plant, or contribute to increased nocardia formation in the activated sludge process, which can result in plant interference. Also, fog waste can cause problems with the sludge dewatering units, such as belt filter press clogging. We have mentioned the potential problems with pH and corrosion. Organic overloading to the wastewater treatment plant can occur if the fog waste volume and concentrations are too great for the wastewater treatment plant units to handle. This is especially a concern for small wastewater treatment plants. If the POTW is accepting fog waste, then you definitely need some type of pretreatment or primary treatment of the fog. A number of POTWs are using anaerobic digestion units to receive the fog waste, which aids in gas production. However, some POTWs have reported problems when the anaerobic digester's recirculation system is not functioning properly. Then there can be a scum layer buildup or other complications. For the sludge dewatering processes, note that there may be odor problems associated with this unless the fog waste is treated prior to dewatering. A trend in many cities is fog waste accepted at private treatment facilities. The final product from these facilities is used as fuel and as another beneficial reuse. On to portable toilets or chemical toilets. These are waste from portable toilets, type 3 marine sanitation devices, and chemical toilets are pumped similarly to septic tanks and transported to the treatment works for discharge. Hauled waste from chemical toilets may be incompatible with POTW operations due to antibacterial and disinfecting agents used in the chemical toilet. The disinfecting agents and odor masking agents used in chemical toilets can contain organic compounds that may interfere with the POTW operations. Also, during the winter months in some areas of the country, alcohol or antifreeze has been added by some companies. These organic compounds can not only be a potential for toxicity issues at the wastewater treatment plant, but also can cause increases in the organic loading to the plant. A note on quaternary ammonium compounds is that they can have a surfactant quality or detergent-like quality that disrupts cell membranes, and they're also bactericidal depending on the concentrations used. The BOD, total suspended solids, and an oil and grease concentration from chemical toilets are somewhat similar to septic, as you can see here. Chemical toilet metals concentrations are not normally as high as septic. However, depending on the chemicals used, the metals may be increased, especially zinc and copper, which are biological inhibitors. Thus again, the strong recommendation to know specific details on the chemicals used by a particular company and pollutant concentrations of the chemical toilet waste. Controls to protect the POTW are specific to portable and chemical toilets include having information on the chemical used, and it is recommended to require the chemical toilet company to report to the POTW when any chemical mixture changes are made. Note here in the slide about the 1% value. 1% is equal to 10,000 milligrams per liter. So when you're talking to someone or they give you an MSDS sheet and they say my product only has less than 5% of a chemical, that is substantial depending on the type of chemical. So just keep that in mind. Now for some other haul waste types. Landfill leachate, as defined in 40 CFR 258.2, is the liquid that is passed through or emerges from solid waste and contains soluble, suspended, or miscible materials removed from such waste. The type, age, and location of the landfill and a number of other factors can affect the landfill leachate pollutant concentrations. Again, site-specific data needs to be collected so an assessment can be made by the POTW to determine if the landfill leachate can be accepted at the wastewater treatment plant. Here are some pollutant concentration ranges for some parameters. As you can see, the pollutant concentration for particular pollutants can be very high for landfill leachate. Also, I want you to know that the proposed development document will also have median concentrations for hazardous waste landfills as well. Here are some other pollutants that are recommended to be analyzed to determine if the POTW can accept the landfill leachate. Note that semi-volatile organics, including phenolic compounds and phthalates, and volatile organics, including BTEX, or benzene, toluene, ethylene, and xylene analysis should be conducted for landfill leachate. I want to make a note on phenol analysis. Several cities have had problems with interference due to using the colorimetric analysis, or the 4AAP colorimetric analysis for phenol, because sulfides and color can interfere. So just keep that in mind when you're doing analysis for phenols. The source of groundwater remediation waste is from remediation sites where groundwater is being treated due to contamination. Some remediation waste can come from Superfund sites, Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA sites, which is more commonly referred to as Superfund sites. POTWs can determine whether to accept waste from these cleanup operations. In addition, POTWs may require the same controls on these discharges, such as permitting, application of local limits, other monitoring that will be required on any other waste discharge from any other source. Most of the remediation waste from non-Superfund sites have been treated and contain only trace amounts of toxics that can be accepted at the wastewater treatment plant without causing problems. However, some remediation sites may be discharged at a rate or pollutant concentration that causes pass-through or interference. Groundwater remediation waste associated with fuel-contaminated groundwater may contain benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene, methyl tert-butyl ether, naphthalene, petroleum oils and grease, and lead. POTW operators should require remediation site operators to provide information on the volume, the pollutants, and the pollutant concentration of the waste they propose to deliver to the POTW. Some POTWs have calculated a local limit for BTEX, which greatly helps when determining if groundwater remediation waste could be received at the wastewater treatment plant. The source of non-hazardous industrial waste can come from any number of industrial processes. It includes waste generated by non-domestic sources that are not regulated as hazardous waste under 40 CFR Part 264. These waste may include processed wastewater that an industrial facility decides to have hauled rather than discharged directly to the sewer system. These include cooling water, boiler blowdown, and they could contain industrial process waste. Industrial waste can be from categorical processes and or non-categorical processes. Non-categorical industrial haul waste can include waste from food processing industries, industrial laundries, water softener facilities, and a variety of metal and organic bearing waste from a variety of industrial and commercial sources. Hauled waste from food processors can have high concentrations of BOD, solids, oil, and grease that can cause organic overload at the POTW, including upset, inhibition, and pass-through. Industrial laundry waste can have high organics and solvents if they wash shop rags and towels. I suggest that prior to accepting any commercial, or industrial process wastewater, the POTW should characterize the types of waste generally generated by the industry. EPA has industry sector notebooks on several industry types. The web address to the industry sector notebooks is provided at the bottom of this slide. If the hauled waste is from a categorical industrial facility, it will be regulated as a categorical industry, and its discharge must meet categorical standards to protect the POTW. POTWs must apply categorical pretreatment standards to waste generated by categorically regulated processes, whether the waste is discharged through the sewer system or hauled to the POTW. An example of this is haul waste from a metal finisher subject to 40 CFR 433.17. They must meet the applicable federal categorical pretreatment standards and limits of 40 CFR 433.17. However, industrial and commercial waste, which are not regulated by a categorical pretreatment standard, may be incompatible with treatment plant operations. Although not subject to categorical standards, these waste may be subject to local limits. Under 40 CFR 403.12J, industrial users are required to notify the POTW of any substantial changes in the volume or character of pollutants discharge. POTWs should require this same notification from waste haulers that discharge industrial wastewater. If a POTW accepts hauled industrial waste, including waste regulated by categorical pretreatment standards, it should also consider permitting the waste generator as well as the waste hauler. In other words, be sure to check up through your industrial waste survey that you're covering this industry if they're in your jurisdiction. If not, you may want to contact the jurisdiction the industry is in that the haul waste was received or pumped from to make them aware. A reminder, if you're unaware, if you're uncertain about the applicability of categorical standards, the POTW should request a description of activities conducted and what processes generate wastewater to help make the correct determination. Hazardous waste is defined in 40 CFR Part 261 or 264 as a solid waste or combination of solid waste, which because of its quantity, concentration, or physical, chemical, or infectious characteristics may cause or significantly contribute to an increase in mortality or an increase in serious, irreversible, or incapacitating illness, or pose a substantial present or potential hazard to human health or the environment when properly stored, treated, transported, disposed of, or otherwise managed. POTWs that accept hazardous waste by truck, rail, or dedicated pipe within the property boundary of the plant are considered to be hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facilities, or TSDFs, and subject to RCRA regulations under 40 CFR Part 264. If a POTW has a question regarding the classification of a haul waste type, please contact your state regulatory agency or US EPA. Also, for more information on hazardous waste identification, refer to the guidance manual here provided on the slide. Is identification of hazardous waste delivered to POTWs by truck, rail, or dedicated pipe. A little bit more on hazardous waste. EPA has determined that some specific wastes are hazardous. These wastes are incorporated into lists published by the agency and organized into these categories that you see. An F waste is one from a common manufacturing and industrial process. An example here would be spent halogenated solvents used in degreasing. And for a K waste, these are an example of this would be bottom sediment sludge from the treatment of waste from wood preserving processes that use creosote or pentachlorophenol. In other words, it's waste generated from a specific industry. Okay, to recap, do not accept hauled waste until you have accounted for the hauled waste loading in local limits calculations and conducted a technical review to determine if it will cause impacts at the POTW. Remember, if you're the pretreatment coordinator in your city or you're on the pretreatment team and there is a plant upset due to hauled waste, then you are going to be the one everyone's looking to. So just be aware of that. So you need to make everyone aware of their protection of the POTW for hauled waste. A few POTWs apply local limits to hauled waste. However, in most cases, the hauled waste concentrations exceed the local limits. Each POTW should account for the hauled waste loading for each particular pollutant in the local limits calculation. If your wastewater treatment plant has not accounted for hauled waste pollutant loadings in the local limits calculations, then you should do so. You can use the formula in this slide, which is from EPA's Local Limits Development Guidance document. And you need to account for each of the hauled waste pollutant loadings to the POTW, each type. What else can I do to protect the treatment plant? When you're doing the overall assessment, you need to ask questions such as, are unit operations suitable to accept the particular hauled waste? Get samples, identify at what concentration of BOD solids or other pollutant will the activated sludge units, biosolids treatment, or other treatment units be impaired. When establishing maximum volumes or loads per day, which you should establish this on the basis of each particular hauled waste type, not just in general, we receive hauled waste, but what type of hauled waste are you receiving, or do you plan to accept at the plant? And I believe that's all we have time for. We're moving on.
Great. Thank you, Byron, for the informative presentation on issues specific to each hauled waste type. Just to let everyone in the audience know, we have 364 unique viewers today, and that would be a total of 815 people total viewing. Before we get to some of the questions that came in during Byron's presentation, let's see if our audience members can answer these next quiz questions. The first question is a multiple choice. Septic zinc sources include the following: A, personal hygiene products, sunscreen, etc. B, plumbing and pipes. C, cleaning agents. D, medicines. Or E, all of the above. As we were sorting through the questions that came in for Byron, I'm noticing that some of the questions are beyond the scope of this webcast. Please remember that unfortunately we are unable to answer every question or those that are very facility specific. Now the answer to the quiz question. The correct answer is E, all of the above. As Byron discussed earlier in his presentation, the domestic sources of zinc and septage include personal hygiene products, plumbing and pipes, and some cities may add zinc polyphosphate to their drinking water as a corrosion inhibitor. Additionally, zinc is a carrier for many prescription medications. We have one more quiz question for the audience before we get to those questions submitted for Byron. The second question here is a true or false type question. Hauled waste from chemical toilets may be incompatible with POTW operations due to antibacterial and disinfection agents used in the chemical toilets. While everyone is answering this question, I would like to remind you that a certificate of participation is now available if you joined us at the beginning of the webcast. Now for the answer. The correct answer is true. The disinfecting agents and odor masking agents used in chemical toilets can contain organic compounds that could interfere with the POTW operations. Also, during the winter months in some areas of the country, alcohol or antifreeze has been added by some companies. These organic compounds can not only be a potential for toxicity issues at the wastewater treatment plant, but also can cause increases in the organic loading to the plant. Thank you to everyone for answering these short quiz questions. Before we start the next question and answer session, a reminder, if your question wasn't answered during the webcast, we have posted the speaker's contact information in case you would like to contact them after today. You can also find a copy of the slides by clicking on the Downloads button at the top of your screen. Let's get to a few of the questions from the audience that came in for Byron. Since we're a bit ahead, it looks like we might be able to squeeze in a few more than expected. The first question, Byron, is what are some of the worst things you have seen haulers do, or what are major problems you know of that have been caused by waste haulers?
Waste haulers have been caught and prosecuted for illegal discharging waste into manholes. A lot of people think this is just at night, but we've had instances that I've talked to cities and seen where they're doing it in daylight, around behind shopping malls and industrial sites, what have you. That is probably the most common problem. We also had an incident where a hauler tried to cheat when he did self-sampling from the top of his tank, 5,000-gallon tank on a truck. He had a bucket of cleaner waste in his truck that he sampled instead of clean water basically, instead of sampling the actual hauled waste load. That was caught on camera to get them. Wastewater treatment plants have had their digesters ruined by hauled waste with incompatible and hazardous materials. Pass-through interference has occurred. We reiterate, POTW should be particularly careful about accepting any trucked wastewater from a site that is known to handle, store, manufacture, or sell any type of materials that are incompatible or hazardous. This could include service stations, garages, metal finishing and plating plants, facilities that handle pesticides, factories that use solvents, or any chemical manufacturing or processing facilities. If there's any doubt, it is better to refuse the load than to be responsible for inadvertently causing extreme harm to the plant. Ann?
Great, thanks. This next question from a POTW wants to know whether or not they should accept brown grease and yellow grease.
Well, several facilities have tried to or been involved in the yellow grease industry, which is when the waste fryer oil or other oils and greases collected in the grease recycle bin at food service establishments. And they are generally used, the majority of the yellow grease is in animal feed additives, soap products, cosmetic products, or biodiesel. Some have recently reported increased theft incidents with yellow grease at food service establishments. So based on the market demands, yellow grease should be beneficially reused. It would be up to the POTW if they want to be involved in that, of course, but a lot of times the private industry has a big drive and market for that. The brown grease is what is discharged from the food service establishment kitchen fixtures to the grease interceptor or grease trap, and each POTW needs to evaluate if their POTW has the capacity and treatment ability to handle brown grease waste.
Thanks, Byron. Another question here from the POTW. They'd like to know whether they should inspect and audit hauled waste companies.
Many cities are inspecting or auditing hauled waste companies to verify manifest records and to track the source that is listed on the manifest to determine if there is any falsification of data. Some cities permit waste haulers and require monthly reporting on the facilities and types of waste pumped, so verification of the source pump, driver, date, and time pump can be verified. So I would say, yes, I think that is a good idea to do.
Thanks, Byron. I think we have time for one more question here for you. And that's, because of the types of things that can go wrong at a treatment plant, is it worth the trouble to accept hauled waste?
Well, that's up to the POTW, but accepting hauled waste, it does generate revenue through fees, and it does provide a service to the community. Also, by having a program to control impacts to the plant and accepting the hauled waste under certain rules, the POTW may prevent illegal dumping and ensure it's disposed of properly. Also, most haul waste does not cause trouble at the plant when managed correctly, but of course the size of your treatment plant and your capacity does come into play for that.
Thanks, Byron. I want to remind all participants that this presentation will be archived so you can access it after today's live presentation. The archived webcast will be posted in a couple of weeks on EPA's NPDES website. Finally, I'd like to ask the audience members to complete the survey that will be appearing on the screen. please consider completing the survey and let us know your thoughts. We do appreciate your feedback as we work to improve our webcast. I think we have time for a few more questions that came in. I believe we have a question for Jan. Jan, someone at a small POTW wants to know what regulation applies to them if the POTW doesn't have an approved pretreatment program.
Okay, well, if we have a POTW, regardless of size, that doesn't have a pretreatment program, but also particularly paying attention to small ones, you need to remember that the pretreatment regulations regarding the restrictions or the prohibitions on industrial waste apply nationally to all industrial waste received at POTWs. The POTW, particularly, even if it doesn't have a pretreatment program, should be designating a place or a prohibition on its acceptance of hauled waste. 40 CFR 403.5B8, as I said in my part of the presentation, applies to any POTW that accepts hauled waste, that it is only able to be accepted at designated locations that the POTW specifies. Also, any industrial waste that comes into the POTW, if it has a pretreatment program, and even if it doesn't have a pretreatment program, needs to pay attention to the specific prohibitions at 403.5B 1 through 7. Basically, don't accept anything that could cause corrosion. Don't accept anything that could cause an explosion. That's all things that the POTW needs to be aware of for very common but rudimentary protection of your sewage treatment plant. You should also, as Lynn discussed, be on the lookout for any changes in the wastewater flow volume or characteristics in your collection system trunk lines to ensure that there are not illegal or unscrupulous discharges into the system. You need to make sure no one's going around, middle of the night or middle of the day, popping a manhole cover and just discharging something into it. A POTW needs to be aware of what's coming into its sewage treatment plant to ensure that its piping system and its plant and its workers are protected.
Great, thanks. I think we have one more for you. This question is, what types of waste are haulers prohibited from hauling to POTWs?
Well, again, it's up to the POTW to decide what types of hauled waste it decides to accept, and similarly, what types of hauled waste it decides to prohibit. It's really up to the POTW. You could, as a POTW, decide to prohibit the acceptance of categorical waste being hauled into you. You could decide as a POTW to prohibit the discharge of hauled RCRA type waste and other hazardous type waste, but you might instead decide to accept some of the fog wastewater. It's really up to you, but as this presentation has tried to show, there are many considerations you need to take into account just when planning out your program and what you want to accept, what you don't want to accept, and what are the consequences of that decision. And for that reason, we've discussed the concept of what might be in a sewer ordinance for hauled waste, what you might want to develop as your procedures for considering what waste to accept or not accept. You may recall that Lynn had a flow diagram with yes and no questions to help you come to reach a decision. And then also, if you do plan to accept waste that is hauled into you, be it hauled waste that is of an industrial nature or just hauled waste that might even just be of a septic nature, that you might want to develop a permitting program to ensure that you know exactly what you're receiving and how you are verifying that what you might be receiving is not going to hurt your plant.
Thank you, everyone, for those great questions. We are sorry that we are not able to get to all of the questions today, but a certificate is available for each participant by clicking on their certificate button at the top of your screen. Their certificate is also available by typing the link on this slide into your web browser. You can type each of the attendees' names into their certificate and print their certificates from your computer using this link. Well, it looks like that's about all the time we have today. At this time, I'd like to conclude today's webcast and thank our speakers, Jan, Lynn, and Byron. And of course, thanks to everyone who joined us. Please note that the next scheduled pretreatment webcast, Pretreatment 201, Calculating Limits, is currently being developed. Please check EPA's website for more details about upcoming webcasts by clicking on Trainings and Meetings at www.epa.gov/NPDES. The Pretreatment 201 Calculating Limits webcast will be a continuation of the Pretreatment 101 course on IU permitting and will discuss how to calculate production-based limits and limits for commingled streams. Also, if you'd like to listen to this webcast again, this webcast will be archived on EPA's Trainings and Meetings page in a couple of weeks. Once again, thank you everyone for participating in today's webcast. This ends our Pretreatment 101 webcast on POTW pretreatment considerations and permitting programs for hauled waste.